Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Manuela and Moschella about her new book, Great Expectations, Slow Transformations, Institutions, Decision-Making Processes, and Public Policies. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsey School of International Affairs. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international affairs here to the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Today, my guest is Manuela Moschella. She is a senior fellow here at CIGI and an expert in the international financial system. And she's also the co-editor of a new book, Great Expectations, Slow Transformations, which is about the international financial system. What inspired you to co-edit a book on change in the international financial regulatory system?
Well, my co-author, which is Eleni Tsingo, and I were highly inspired by the fact that we had the impression that there was a kind of mismatch between words and deeds when we arrived at the height of the global financial crisis. And this was particularly so also in light of the rhetoric and the historical analogies that were used at the time. So let's just go back in a minute at what happened in 2008. In 2008, when the crisis broke out, it really revealed some important regulatory issues in the regulation of global finance. There were the private sector was basically allowed to take on too much risk, and in particular, more risk that it could safely handle. And of course, it was not the sole cause of the crisis, but it was an important one. We are not debating here about the origins of the crisis, but certainly there were regulatory problems. What were the regulatory problems? First of all, regulators around the world, and especially in the advanced economy, did not warn the private sector about the risks that they were incurring, so there were inaction problems. There were also problems in the sense that regulators were complacent, so they closed an eye in front of what was happening in the private sector. And finally, for some areas of the financial sector, there were no rules at all. Think about the offshore financial system, the shadow banking system. So all these problems combined with and fall under the heading of regulatory problems. So when the crisis burst, there was a huge public backlash against bankers and financial institutions generally. Policymakers took a strong position on the heels of public reaction. And at that time, and there were, you could hear a lot about the historical analogy of the Bretton Woods. So we were basically thinking that we were living through a new Bretton Woods moment. But of course, the Bretton Woods moment referred to a moment in time when the architecture of the global financial and economic system was seriously and profoundly revised. Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister, Nicolas Sarkozy, they all used this important historical analogy. So the moment was ripe, for big change. And next to policymakers, also in the academic community, there was this sense of change. I'm coming from the political economy literature, and in the political economy literature, there is extensive debate on what are the conditions that favor reform, and all these conditions, the textbook conditions were in place because basically we had a major shock, a financial shock, we had public reactions of public and governmental attention, and we also had a shift in venue because usually global financial regulation is dealt with in technical fora. We may talk about these technical fora, basically international financial institutions, regulatory bodies. But for the time being, in 2008, 2009, there was this shift of forums. So we shifted from technical areas to political leaders. There was the creation of the G20 leaders. That is one of the main research agenda here at CIGI. So there was these expectations that when political leaders took on their hands the regulatory process, something could really change. So again, it was the perfect storm, both in public policy and in the academic literature. We expected. That's the reason why we titled the book Great Expectations, because the expectations were so great. Well, when we started the project in 2011, I mean, we couldn't help but thinking that, I mean, words did not match with the rhetoric and the expectations that were initially raised.
Right.
I mean, and to make a long story short, I mean, the main finding of the book is a sober assessment of the regulatory process. We basically arrive at the conclusion that there has not been so much change, and not so much so, but also, I mean, the pace of the regulatory reform has been largely incremental and not the kind of boom that we expected, like the Bretton Woods moment.
Right. And just building on that, in the book, you do focus on institutions and key actors. For our audience, who are the main players or institutions involved with regulating the global financial system? And collectively, what are they trying to accomplish?
Well, Andrew, let me allow to switch the two questions.
Sure.
Okay, let me start with the second one, because I think it's important to state clearly at the beginning, I mean, what these actors, with their public policy, with their behavior, are trying to do. And in a nutshell, we can say that all these actors are trying to achieve the goal of financial stability. Okay, because what's the problem here is that financial markets, as any other markets, need rules and institutions to function effectively. And in the financial market is especially so. So basically, because of course the value of financial assets is not intrinsic, but it depends on trust and confidence that the future value will not be significantly disrupted and discounted. So the basic thing is that all the actors that are involved in the governance of the financial system are involved in this big and important task of maintaining financial stability. So devising those rules that allow the financial system to be stable and to not disrupt the real economy in terms of lost output and unemployment as we're witnessing today.
Right. Thank you so much. When we come back, I'd like to pick up on a point in your book, specifically about the idea of incrementalism. We will be back in a moment with Manuela Moschella. You have been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Manuel, in the book, the central argument is that even after a major financial crisis, really what we can hope for is incremental change rather than revolutionary change. And I thought you made a very compelling case for the benefits of incrementalism. Can you say a little bit about this idea and how it shaped your analysis?
Thank you, Andrew, because I think it is an important question that really speaks to one of the core arguments we are trying to make in the book. Because usually, I mean, when we talk about incrementalism, we tend to equate incrementalism with no change at all, or, you know, it's something of a cover for conservative forces to prevail over the forces of change. What we're trying to do in the paper is not to take a normative position on incrementalism is bad and revolutionary change is good, but really to try to analyze what we can achieve with incremental change. And it's important that one of the findings of the book is that incrementalism was really instrumental to achieve those kind of reforms that could be impossible using a revolutionary approach. So basically, for instance, in the area of introducing macroprudential regulation as opposed to a focus on idiosyncratic institutions, so taking a holistic picture, it is an important change, but it had to be introduced slowly because, of course, it was introduced into technical debates. It was introduced in fora such as the Bank of International Settlements among economists, and so it needed time to be elaborated and articulated. So basically, by introducing gently new concepts, new way of thinking of regulation, allow this principle to get into the reform agenda. So we thought that even if incrementalism is not a significant change from the very beginning, it could nonetheless be conceived as an instrument to nonetheless kickstart the reform process and to overcome veto players, to overcome opposition to the reform process. Because also in terms of private sector lobbying, some of the chapters that make up the book have found that in many cases, for instance, in the case of the regulation of banks or in the case of the derivative regulation, private sector actors did not oppose vehemently the reform process exactly because it was incremental and it delayed the implementation process. And so they basically perceived that they could accept reform in the first place because they could use lobbying later on at a later stage of the reform process. So at the beginning, incrementalism was really a way to kickstart the process. So it is not necessarily bad. And the other thing is that we don't know where it will lead us in the future. I mean, because big change can happen in either of two ways. I mean, one way is the traditional way, is the kind of paradigmatic change. I mean, we have big revolutionary change in the first place. But the political science literature has also unveiled a different dynamic, that is the accumulation of small little changes over time. And even though these are small, as taken on their own, their accumulation may have a snowball effect. And so even if now we are witnessing, those kind of changes that are just tweaks to the system, collectively they can bring us somewhere where we do not expect it from today's perspective. Right. I don't know, they may empower actors that were not supposed to empower, something like that we call the unintended consequences, sure. Right? I mean, we cannot control everything.
And just building on that, I mean, you do qualify that in the book that there is a tension within the system between those who do want change, your change agents, and those who are what you call veto players. And can you explain these two terms and how these two groups interact with each other?
Absolutely. Well, to start with, I mean, when we talk about change agents and veto players, we have in mind, of course, on the one hand, those actors that support reform, that are more prone to change things. And veto players are those actors that, on the contrary, want to maintain the status quo. What we say in the book is that it's not possible to put identity on these change actors and veto player ex ante. Because, for instance, I mean, both change agents and veto players can be states, national authorities, they can be private sector actors, they can be international financial institutions, regulatory agents at both the domestic and international level. So these identities change according to issue areas. So I give you an example in terms of states. In some issue area, there was a standoff between the Anglo-Saxon countries, primarily the US and the UK, against the continental European countries, Germany and France in the first place. This was, for instance, the case on banking regulation, so on the debate within the Bank for International Settlement. So basically, there were the UK and the US pushing for more reforms, so there were the change agents, and the continental European countries that were more concerned about change, so there were the veto players in that case. But in other case studies, for instance, in the case of the regulation of the credit rating agencies, the roles were completely different. Because in this case round, we had France and Germany acting as the change agents and the US and the UK acting as the more cautious veto players. So this is just to give an example that, I mean, we cannot label actors ex ante, but very much depend on the empirical research. So we really strike an alarm bell here. You know, sometimes there is a tendency to think that, I don't know, the private sector actor is usually the veto player in global financial regulation, but it's not always the case. For instance, there have been cases in which, like in the resolution regime, in which the private sector has pushed hard for reform. The private sector wanted to harmonize resolution schemes. Whereas in contrast, in other areas, such as in the case of derivative regulation, the private sector was on the veto player side, so they tried to block the reform process. So, you know, there is a continuous tension between change agents and veto players, but what is interesting, at least from our perspective, is that change agents and veto players change continuously. They are not always the same actors all over again. So it is very important to understand and to empirically trace down to the issue area under investigation.
Right. Thank you so much. For the next section, I'd like to pick up on this point and really essentially talk about what are the implications then for our ability collectively to manage another global financial crisis. So we'll be back in a moment with Manuela and Moschella. You have been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Manuela, should we be troubled that it seems like the global community that's involved with regulating the international financial system is only capable of incrementalism? Do we need something more profound than this?
Well, as I said before, I think there is nothing bad in principle in incrementalism, in the incremental type of reform that we are witnessing. What we should be troubled about is when incrementalism pushes policymakers to stop the reform efforts and to lose sight of what is really at stake. This is, for instance, one of the main concerns that we are witnessing nowadays, because of course, now that we are in a different stage of the crisis. I mean, the height of the financial crisis has passed on, and now we have mainly concerns about the implication of the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, of the connections between sovereign debt and banking problems. And in this new environment that is different from the environment we had in 2008, 2009, there is the risk that we lose sight that the financial system has not been made stable as yet. And I mean, there are authoritative voices in this sense. I mean, last year, the Bank of International Settlement, in its annual report, clearly put that there is a lot of leverage in the banking system as well. And also in light of the current accommodative monetary policies in many industrial countries, there is a risk that this monetary accommodation can really stock financial excesses once over again. So the problem lies not so much in incrementalism, but if incrementalism becomes too slow, I mean, and so we lose sight of the fact that the problems are not being completely solved out. Because as I said before, I mean, incrementalism has been important and it's been really instrumental to start the reform process. But the risk is that, I mean, once some steps have been done, that we stop from proceeding along the path. But we stop proceeding along the path right at the moment in which the financial sector is not stable because of leverage is still in the system, and there are other risks coming from the other policies that have been put in place to make the global economy recovering after the crisis. So leverage and accommodative monetary policies can be a serious risk for the stability of the financial system.
And on this point, you've noted that neoliberalism has shown tremendous resilience even after the financial crisis. How does that ideology factor into the governance regime?
Well, in our book, we try to identify the sources of incrementalism. And of course, I mean, the resilience of neoliberal thinking and its application in financial market has been one of the factor that we asked our contributors to test in their empirical analysis. And although, I mean, there are important studies that argue that neoliberalism has been resilient and is one of the major factors that has hindered the reform process, the findings of our book are more cautious in this respect. They are more mixed. In the sense, yes, it's true. I mean, probably the pre-crisis thinking on financial market is still there in certain important aspects. But at the same time, there has been tremendous transformation in terms of ideational thinking, in terms of financial models. The efficient market hypothesis is much less well regarded than it used to be in the past. And all this idea of having a macroprudential regulator next to macroprudential that look at the idiosyncratic risk of individual financial institutions, I think is really now embedded in many regulatory and financial circles. So there have been major transformations in the thinking that underpin the regulation of global finance. In our view, more than the ideational factors, what was a major problem for the reform process was the institutional architecture, because the institutional architecture of global finance is, of course, the result of history. It's the result of the accumulation of many institutions that have been created over time in different historical periods, with the result that we have really a variegated constellation of actors from formal international organizations, transnational web of regulators. And so all this density, all this institutional constellation was a problem in the regulatory reform process, because it involved putting together many different institutions that were not used to talk to each other, that were not used to share data. And so this was one of the major problems we see, more than the ideational resilience of the pre-crisis ideas.
And on that point of institutions, one of the criticisms has been that these regulatory bodies don't have the authority or the resources that they need to effectively fulfill their mandates. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think it is a fair assessment, but it should not be overstated, as usual. I mean, it's true that these institutions cannot force national authorities to take action, but it is undeniable that many of these institutions did not ring an alarm bell and did not ring it with force before the crisis. I mean, there is the notable exception of the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement, which was probably one of the few bodies at the international level that was really concerned about the accumulation of risk that was building up in the system before the crisis. But as for the others, and I mean, Paul Bluestein, for instance, here at CIGI has clearly showed that the Financial Stability Board, the IMF, were really failed in their supervisory role before the crisis. So it is true that, I mean, these institutions probably do not have the power to force policymakers to act, but probably, I mean, if their recommendations would have been clearer and would have been stronger, there is no doubt that, I mean, at least, I mean, the international community, public opinion would have known about the problems that we were running into.
Right. Thank you so much. For the last section, I'd like to come back to some of the policy implications of your research. We'll be back in a moment with Manuela and Moschella. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Manuela, for our final segment, I'd like to talk about some of the policy implications of your research. So perhaps let's just start right there. What would you recommend to decision makers about going forward?
Well, I think that the first lesson that we can learn from the process of regulatory reform that we are witnessing up today is that the regulatory reform is more often than not incremental. So as I was saying before, I mean, the first lesson that policymakers should bear in mind is that if the process of regulatory reform is incremental, they should keep continued and prolonged efforts in the reform process. I mean, it's not just a question of letting the reform process start, as the G20 did in 2008, when they really they played an important role because they really set the priorities, they set a reform agenda that was ambitious, they delegated power to the international financial institutions, to the Financial Stability Board to bring on and to develop the reform agenda. But that is not enough, because of course if incrementalism is the order of the day, then we need more sustained application, sustained encouragement and efforts from policymakers. I mean, policymakers should not really lose sight of even though they have other commitments, probably more compelling in different moments in time, but they should keep the pressure on the regulatory reform process. And probably this is one of the most important things. The second lesson, I think it's important that policymakers have clearly in mind what I was referring to before, that is the institutional architecture where they are operating. Because it's always a complicated and delicate balance between policymakers and technocracy, so people that have the technical expertise to develop the rules, also in combination with the private sector actors. And so that they should be aware that technocrats act differently than from policymakers. First of all, they are not responding to public opinion. Secondly, I mean, their way of acting is different in the sense that they really need data. They really need time to develop alternative options, alternative scenarios. So they are more used to act on a different time frames that policymakers are. I mean, because since they are not responding to the public, I mean, they need time to really have a look at the data available and to develop the best options, the best strategy. So they should be aware of these difficulties. They should be aware of the difficulties that exist in letting these different institutions that operate at the global financial level to talk to each other and to put in common, to create common tables to discuss issues. And this is important, especially at a time where, we are going towards increased financial integration. Probably there has been a backstop during the crisis, but again, the future probably will go again towards greater integration. So we cannot go towards greater integration, but at the same time, political fragmentation. So this is the second lesson that policymakers should bear in mind. Having an idea who are in charge of the reform process, and who is in charge are usually technocrats that operate on a different time scale and following different incentives than they are.
And just to wrap up, although perhaps the worst of the 2008 financial crisis is behind us, I think many would argue, we're not out of the woods by any stretch. What are your thoughts on the international community's ability to manage a future crisis? Perhaps one on the same scale as the one we experienced in 2008, or even one that's bigger?
Well, I'm not negative on the ability of the international community to withstand the crisis, because of course many mistakes were made during the crisis. The result of the reform process is not brilliant, probably. But if there is one positive assessment I can make about the crisis, it's really about the sense of urgency and the response that the international community was able to put in place. We are not living in the 1930s where there were not, all the institutions we have today, they made a mistake, but they really provided policymakers and the international community with the forum where you can address the problems. So I think that, of course, we cannot rule out financial instability again in the future. Probably, we will have other major financial crises. We cannot know where and when it will happen. But I'm confident that we have the institutional architecture, at least to sit down together and to try to develop a common regulatory response. Again, we heard many analogies with the 1930s and the Great Depression during the global financial crisis, but I think that one of the major differences is really this institutional architecture that is in place today, and there was none in the 1930s. So even though cooperation at the international level is difficult, and we see it every day, at least we have an institutional architecture we can build on, and they can provide, the first line of defense, putting together policymakers and provide a forum for discussion.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, and congratulations again on the book coming out. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.